Hello everyone, welcome to the first video in a new Python programming series. Today we will build a simple API client from scratch in Python. An API client is an application that allows you to send HTTP requests to different endpoints in a simple way. API clients are often used for debugging and testing APIs, as the name suggests. There's a lot of these tools in the market, the most popular being Postman or, HTTP Toolkit maybe. But we can build our own. So, let's get started. The first thing I would like to do is to open CMD and start a new virtual environment. Alright, once it's created, we have to activate it using this simple command. Now we will need one library called requests, so I'm just gonna pip install it. Install the requests just like that. Alright, now I'm going to start by creating a class called myRequest. This simple class will encapsulate an HTTP request, as the name suggests. Well, the request consists of mostly 4 different parts. First being the URL, then the HTTP method like get or post or delete. Then there are the headers and the body of the request. Alright. Let's also add some hints to our arguments. I would like headers to be a dictionary because it's basically a list of pairs, so a simple dictionary would be enough. Alright. Now, let's create a function called send. Well, this function will basically send our request to the server or or some website. Right. First thing, I'm going to declare an R variable, which will stand for our response. Then in a try except block, I'm going to send those different requests. For now, let's just pass here. Okay. First, if method is get, I'm going to use requests.get. We first need to import this library. So let's just do import requests. Alright. Now the first argument in the request.get method is the URL. Then as a keyword I'm going to pass the headers. Headers, and then it's everything for the get method. Now let's do the same for the post method. And similarly, the first argument is the URL, then the headers, and then in the post request we also need to pass the body as the data argument. Oops, I live too much Java lately. Right, now for this simple demonstration I'm going to only cover like 4 of the basic methods. The other one is put, which does just updates something on the backend. the arguments are basically the same as in the post function. Then also the delete, which, as the name suggests, causes the object in the backend to delete. It's similar to get because we don't send the body in a delete request. Alright, now what if the request is defined with something else? Well, I'm going to simply raise an exception. Method not supported. And this exception will be cached in this block. So here I'm just going to do response equals headers Alright, and else I'm just going to wrap the response object in a dictionary, just for simpler use. Right, maybe one more thing, the status code. It's also like one of the most important things in the HTTP response, because status code tells us the request has failed or not. So, for example, in this exception, I'm just going to add 404, but here I will pass the status code from the response. Right, and now finally return response. Alright, let's test the simple class. Okay, I'm going to start by testing a simple GET request for google.com. Now we have to pass https google.com as the first argument, then the method, which will be get. Then we don't really need any headers. We also don't need a body for a get request. Now just do r1.send. We also want to save the response. Then we can just print response. Let's do python my request.py. Okay, and as you can see, we received the HTML and JavaScript, like some code, I guess. We can also get the headers, but just that. As you can see, this is a lot of headers, and it tells us many different things about how our request was processed. As you can see, we have a header telling us what kind of response is in the body, the char set. We also have cookies, but I plan to cover them in a different video. Headers are basically just some metadata about how we should process the response. You also can get the status code, which is 200. Okay, next I'm going to test a post request. I will call a mock API called jsonplaceholder.typicode.com. First, let's define a body for our request, because it will be a post request. It needs a body. Now, let's define our class. I mean our object. Alright, as you can see, I changed the get to the post, and I also added a header called content type application/JSON. And this tells the server that I'm going to send in JSON in the body. Now when I do r2.send and save it in the response, I'm going to print it. Let's also comment out the Google request. I also received a JSON. This tells us that this object was created with a new ID. As you can see, I did not specify the ID here. This was added by the backend on the server. This is in theory because the backend here is just a mock backend. And also check the headers and the status code. As you can see, now we have 201. Now, why is it 201 instead of 200? Well, 201 stands for object created, while 200 just stands for OK. And that means that a new object was created in the database or somewhere else, I guess. Okay, now that we've verified that this thing works, let's try to create a graphical user interface for it. Now we will need two more files. I will call them API client.py. This will be our main file, and also API client GUI.py. This will hold the class. Okay, now I'm just going to import Tkinter. Not that way, that way. And also the TTK submodule. And also from my request import my request. Alright. Let's define our class, which will be called the same as the file name. And I'm going to pass to the constructor something called root, which will be of type tk. That's the top level widget created by Tkinter. Before I continue here, I'm going to also do a little thing here. I'm going to import tk simply, then import the class. Now if underscore underscore name equals underscore underscore main, create the application. So this basically creates the window. We pass the window to this class and it will do some modifications on it. And then we run main loop, which is basically the event loop of our window. First I'm going to simply add a title called my API client. Let's test if this works. As you can see, I have a simple window and it's my 3 dots because I guess the window is too small to render the rest of the text. But that's good news, we have a window. Alright, now in the screen you can see the layout for which we will be aiming. We need a top frame that will hold a our logo or our title. Then we need another frame which will hold our send buttons and input boxes, and then a left frame for the request headers in the body and the right frame for response headers and response body. Alright. But the first thing, frame top. Alright, here I created a basic Tkinter frame. I'm going to create a new variable called application label, which will simply display some text in the window. Alright, but as you can see, it is not yet displayed. That's because we haven't called the .grid method on those widgets. First thing, I'm going to call application label.grid. This basically tells our library to display things in a grid-like layout. And this will only have one row, one column. I also would like some padding, I guess. And we have to specify, well, we don't have to specify, but it's helpful, a sticky parameter. It basically tells us that the application label widget will be stick to northwest of the parent widget, which is frame top. We also need to call grid on the frame top. We have column 0 and row also 0. And here, I'd like this sticky parameter to actually be north, south, east, west. See now? Okay, we have a simple text. And I would also like it to have a different background, so that it looks at least somewhat decent. For that we need styles. So before the frame top is defined, I'm going to define a style and give it a nice blue background. Right? And I would like the same thing for the label, because the background is not transparent. I will demonstrate it right now. Here we can add the style, and it would be my.tFrame. Then when we run our application, as you can see, it does not look good. So let's add it here, and also the foreground just white. Also here style equals my.tLabel. Okay, another thing, as you can see, this does not expand to the full width of a window when I do some resizing. That's because we haven't defined the column configs and the row configs. To fix this, you have to do something called root.column configure 0 weight equals 1. This will cause our widget to expand to the full width of the window. Now we're going to need a main frame that will host everything except this application label. Okay, I don't want it to have any styles now. And I'm going to define another frame, which I will call frame request top. Okay, this will cause it to have a padding on left, right, and top and bottom. I'm sorry, I don't remember which one is which, to be honest. But that's okay. Alright, the next thing. We need input boxes and a send button. Here I defined a simple combo box for our requests, because we don't want to specify everything again after wanting to send a different request. So I'm just going to define my request object here. For now, let's just do google.com. And also here, I'm going to define a stringify method. We will return simply the, let's say, the URL, maybe skip the HTTPS part. Now, let's continue building our interface. Here I defined two string vars, and these things are basically attached to a widget, and it will display the value in this variable. Right, next thing, I would like to specify some values for our method box, combo box. And we will have only 4 values, which would look like this. Now we need to also attach them to our input box, like that. And also let's set the get method to be the default option. Alright. Next, let's also define the send button. This method is not yet defined, but I'm just going to define it here and leave it empty, just for now. Okay, and we only need one more, which will be the time variable. It will tell us how many time has elapsed for this request to be processed. I'm going to set it to 00 seconds. Alright. And also let's create the widget for this. Now these things are still not yet displayed on the screen, because for that we need to use the grid parameter, just like here. Actually, let me just write maybe some comments. It will be the app label. And here I'm going to start main content, and under this input. Okay. So let's display these things on the screen. For that, I'm going to call the grid method on the frame request top. I will have two widgets below it, like next to each other, so I'm going to give it a column span of 2. But for now it doesn't do anything. And I'm also set the sticky option to northwest. Okay, let's see what happens now. There's also nothing yet, because if a frame does not have like any children attached to it, it will be simply empty. Now, request combo box. Now we should have a combo box. I don't see it. Oh, okay, no way. Because we haven't called the grid on the mainframe. We also need to do that. Actually, let me just do it here, maybe. Row will be 1, because on the row 0 we have the frame top widget. And the column will be 0. Now it should work. Yes, there we go. And we have google.com. Okay, let's continue adding our widgets. Oops, forgot grid here. Alright, and here we have our options, but for now it doesn't do anything yet. I would like some padding between those elements, and for that I'm going to use a simple for loop. For each child in the frame request top, I'm going to add 5 padding and 5 padding horizontally and 5 padding vertically. It could be specified here by something like this, but I just don't want to repeat myself. Nice. Okay, let's go to the next part. Now we need to create a left frame, which will host our request headers and the request body. For that, I'm going to use the label frame. It's a bit different from a normal frame, because it also has a nice border and a label at the top. We'll see how it looks in a second. Okay, for input of the headers, I'm going to use a simple text box, because I don't want the user interface to be overcomplicated. I specified height here to be a bit shorter from the body text, just for aesthetic reasons, because normally height is 24, so this will be over twice as short. Alright, now we need to display our elements. So frame left.grid. Row will be 1, because in the main frame, the first row is the frame request top. The column will still be 0. Also, let's specify some padding. Here, still nothing. But soon, after we do self.request headers text.grid. Now here row will be also 1 and the column will also, row will be 0 and the column will also be 0, because it's the first element in the grid of this frame. And the same thing for the request body text, but now the row will be 1. The column will still be 0. Let's add some padding. Now, as we can see, it works. Now we also need to add the right frame. And I'm going to simply shamelessly copy everything from here. Just rename stuff. Frame right here, this will be response. And here I'm going to call this self.response header text, self.response body text, and here frame right. Yeah, don't forget this here. Okay, let's see how this looks. Whoa, for some reason this does not display anything. And that's because with the column here, column here should be 1. Because it was overlaying with frame left. My bad. Nice. Now we don't really need to do anything much for the user interface. The only thing left is to actually add some functionality to this. First, I'm going to define a select request method, and this will update our input boxes so that they match the values of the request here. Let's start by getting the requests object from our array. Next, let's just set all those variables to the variables of the object. Pretty simple. We don't use the normal equal sign because we need to use those setters and getters. This is not a normal string variable. Oops, here I meant request.url. Now, updating those text widgets is kind of tricky, but it's because we need to do something like this. And then something like this. I'm going to declare this class function soon, so it does some formatting for our headers. And now also the same thing for our request body. Alright, let's go back to my request class and define a new class method. Well, I don't really want to make this a normal method because we'll be using this later. In case you're a bit confused about this design decision. Alright, this will look something like this. This will be the return value. Now for header, in headers.items, I'm going to simply add the key and the value separated by a double dot mark. I don't remember what it's called in English. A colon or a semicolon? I'm not sure. Well, this should hopefully work. But I'm not calling this function anywhere. So here at the end of the constructor, I'm going to call self.selectRequest0. As you can see, it set the URL and the method, but this is empty, just as it should be. I would also like for the combo box to be to have Google selected here. And I can just do this, I think. The same thing as in the method box. Perfect. Okay, but this still does not work. Let's also test if the headers and the body is filled properly. So here I'm going to define another request. I'm just going to copy from this. Okay. And instead of 0, I'm going to select request 1. Okay, we have the header and the body, but here it's still google.com what we need to do now is to call the select request when this changes. Okay, sorry about the interruption. Now we need to call select request when the combo box actually changes. And for that, in the request combo box, we need to do something like this: self.request combo box.bind combo box selected event, and this will call our select request function. Hopefully this will work. Now we need to add a bind for an event combo box selected so that our function is called when this happens. For that, I'm going to declare another function called select request combo box. This will take self and the args, and I'm just going to call self.select request this on the self.request combo box.current. Now hopefully this should work. Yes, it does. Perfect. Okay, now we need to do two more things. We need to parse the request headers and actually send the request by clicking the button. Alright, so next thing that we are going to do is sending the request. Let's start by creating a new variable called current request. And this will actually get the values from the input boxes in case something changes. Next one would be method var get, then the my request.parse headers, I'm going to declare it in a second. Sorry, self.request headers text .get 1.0. Well, this basically tells the text widget to get the stuff from the first index to the last. The syntax is quite weird, but the Tkinter was invented in like 80s, I think, or something like that. And the last thing, self.request body text, and the same thing as above, to be 1.0 and okay. Now parse headers method. Okay, first I'm going to split the text by the -n escape character, which basically tells us, this represents basically a new line. Then I'm going to declare a return variable. This will be returned. And now for header, in header lines, I'm going to split this by the semicolon. And next, if len h equals 2, because sometimes, I don't know, the header may be formatted wrong, so we don't want that. Headers h0 equals h1. All right. Now let's try print it in the console. I wanted to do the send. Okay, it works. Now let's simply put this thing on the screen. Nice. We can browse all of the headers in a nice way, and also the body, which the backend returned. There's one more thing I would like to do, and that is to measure how much time the request has taken. And for that, we will need two things. Actually three. Time, threading, and queue. Because we'll have to make... We will need to call this in a thread. I'm sorry, this. Alright, just let's call a start time, actually time perf counter. Then we will need a queue. Then we will need to create a thread. Our target is our function, which will be current requested send. We have to also pass the args. I'm going to update this function in a while so that it also takes an optional parameter queue. Let's also do t.start. You can remove this line. And now we will update the time label when the thread is alive. And then when the thread dies, we'll get the response. But first we also have to I'll do a last update to our myRequest class. We need to pass this here. That equals none. We also have to import queue here. Okay. Here we have to do some magic shenanigans. But not that much. In the final statement here, we're going to simply call if queue is not none. We're going to put the response also in the queue and then return it. Let's test if this does not break anything. Okay, the request seems to be working. Now let's call the API client. As you can see, this took 0.39 seconds, google.com. Well, it took over a second. You can also test maybe some other website. For example, maybe, I don't know, let's just github.com. It also returns some HTML, as you can see here. Alright, that concludes our tutorial. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time.